Good morning and welcome to Global Shift, where we track the global transition away from the neoliberal world disorder towards a new emerging planetary order and help to unpack and make sense of the latest news and geopolitical events. The war in Ukraine is a defining event in the transition away from the globalized neoliberal environment in which we've been living for some 4 decades now. So today I want to talk on that subject and relay 3 important points about the war and about Russia. Firstly, I want to explain why NATO has lost the war in Ukraine. It may look like a stalemate on the ground, but Russia has annexed 23% of Ukraine, which NATO cannot reverse, while at the same time the Ukrainian state is imploding. Those are the 2 specific outcomes that Russia has aimed for since the early so-called negotiation phase of the war ended. This is not the message that the neoconservative NATO ecosystem will want its media to relay to European publics. Secondly, I want to explain why US global hegemony is under threat if the US cannot accept this outcome and come to terms with Russia. The US foreign policy establishment has set the agenda for NATO since the Yugoslav wars, and it is unrelenting. However, times have changed. Not only is NATO enlargement now heading for Nordic territory at the mercy of a member of NATO, Turkey, which is not sanctioning Russia, but Europe, the anchor of US hegemony, is restive. News of defeat could break the camel's back. Thirdly, I want to explain why the sudden eruption of the rebellion by Yevgeny Prigozhin and its equally sudden collapse has in fact strengthened support for the Kremlin's war policy in Russia. The neoconservative NATO narrative that underscores US hegemony has it that the Putin regime is domestically illegitimate and therefore fragile, but far from it. The Kremlin's policy of incorporating oligarchs, however, such as Prigozhin and the Wagner Group, into the management of the state's affairs in Russia, is coming under much closer scrutiny, however, although the unity behind the war in Ukraine is giving the Kremlin room to breathe on this matter. There is an article on the Global Shift website that takes the points that are made here in this video much further. It is much more detailed and comes with links, sources and references. There's only one area where I have chosen to provide more detail in this video than I did in the article. And this is to do with the all-important question of Ukrainian losses in the course of this war. So I start with my first point, the question of the NATO defeat in Ukraine. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US, General Mark Milley, laid the ground for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has been underway without much success since the 4th of June, in an interview he gave on the 2nd of May. He said that the Russian objective in this war, his view, had been to collapse the Zelensky government, take Kyiv and the whole of Ukraine up to the Dnieper River, as well as Odessa and the whole of the Ukraine's Black Sea coast. This description of what Russia's aims were when it attacked on the 24th of February allowed him to say that Russia had failed in its objectives. This has been the standard description, the standard fare about the progress of the war in Western media throughout, and it has enabled it to portray the Russian campaign as a failure and the Russian military as weak and disorganized. This is the trademark NATO rallying cry for recruiting nations to its banner across the world from Scandinavia to East Asia. NATO as the supreme military alliance in the world. The narrative is not only factually wrong, but ethically unsound. The most important thing to get right about the war in Ukraine is the big missed opportunity on February the 28th, 4 days after the launch of Russia's invasion. Peace negotiations between Putin and Zelensky began, mediated by Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, which also involved face-to-face meetings between Ukrainian and Russian officials in Gomel, on a border with Belarus and Ukraine, and then later in Istanbul, in Turkey. In those negotiations, Putin agreed to peace terms which would have seen the Donbass regions of Donetsk and Luhansk remain as autonomous regions of Ukraine, while Crimea remained annexed to Russia. Ukraine would have agreed to stay out of NATO and limit the size of its armed forces. Zelensky's representatives agreed those terms, but the position was reversed as soon as Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson got involved. As Naftali Bennett said in an interview which is referenced with a link in the article on the Global Shift website, it was this intervention by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, by Britain, that by mid-March had derailed all chances of a peaceful solution to this conflict. Putin had withdrawn the forces that were around Kyiv during the March peace negotiations as a sort of sign of goodwill. Ultimately, the total number of troops involved in what he had called at the time the special military operation on the 24th of February was around 90,000. This was in no way a big enough force to achieve the aims that Milley set out, in his opinion, were the aims of Russia, namely to take 400,000 square kilometers of territory, which is equivalent to 2/3 of the area of France or 2/3 of the area of Texas, with one city of 3.5 million people, Kyiv, with two cities of over 1 million people, Kharkiv and Odessa, and several cities of over 500,000 people, as well as a well-fortified standing army trained by NATO of about 250,000 to 260,000 men and potential reserves of an equal number. Given the rapidity with which Putin started negotiations, he could only have envisaged what he called the special military operation as a muscular extension of the negotiation strategy that he had been trying to pursue with the US for a long time, albeit in vain. The problem with that strategy is that he looked militarily weak, and this landed him in the worst of all possible worlds. Not only was his attack hyped as an imperial land grab by an illegitimate regime, but the Russian army itself was represented as a chaotic and disorganized force. Whether or not this was what NATO leaders actually believed, we will never know, because the weapons that they would actually rely on to defeat Russia were the US Treasury's arsenal of sanctions. The Putin regime, it was the Putin regime that was in their sights, not the Russian military. But there would only be momentary relief for NATO. After this negotiation phase of Putin's campaign, after this phase had failed miserably, the Russian military would then turn things around, as indeed would the Russian economy in the face of Russian sanctions, of the United States sanctions, apologies. But to understand Putin's decision-making in February 2022, it is worth backtracking to understand Putin's overall trajectory since the year 2000. The article carried by the Global Shift website provides a background analysis of this in its second part. The article is divided into two parts, a main part and the second part, which has three sections that act as appendices describing in detail certain important background factors. The crucial thing to understand here is that Putin and his coterie from St. Petersburg, both on the right wing, he's the right-wing conservative element of the so-called Siloviki, the men of power, and all the liberals of different hues on the left were engaged collectively in the project of resurrecting the Russian state from the embers of the 1990s. And they all agreed in that the way of pursuing this was by extending the Kremlin's firm control over Russia's energy sector. You can see that as a result of that, you can understand the importance of Ukraine to this new Russian state. Far from it being a mere historical interest or related to some kind of Soviet revanchinism, the concern of Russia over Ukraine had everything to do with its energy policy. Oil and gas sales to Europe traditionally passed through Ukraine. When Ukraine became politically unstable, new pipelines to Germany under the Baltic were constructed, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. US policy from 2005 onwards, besides fomenting a color revolution in Ukraine, would seek to disrupt the direct energy links between Germany and Russia. This, as we've seen, this ultimately resulted, as we've seen, in the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines, about which I have an article on the Global Shift website, by the way. To cut a long story short, Crimea, together with Putin's relationship with Turkish President Erdogan, became crucial to ensuring a southern route for oil and gas supplies to Europe under the Black Sea, to Europe and the rest of the world. And this, when the prospects for the northern routes began to look decidedly bleak. Crimea, where it turns out that 90% of the population are ethnic Russians, became a key to the survival of the Russian state at this stage. If the 2014 Maidan coup hadn't occurred and a new anti-Kyiv regime hadn't been installed, Russian energy interests could have been simply served by an international agreement between Ukraine and Russia, supported by all European countries. A regime sympathetic to an open trading relationship with Russia would have found the problem of neutrality easily resolved. If Crimea is therefore non-negotiable and of existential importance to the Russian state, then the failure of the negotiation phase of the war meant that Russia would have to create a protective belt around it, which is exactly what it did in the next siege phase of the war, in which it took on the Ukrainian military, which had been long ensconced in deep and complex fortifications right across the Donbass, using factory complexes and apartment buildings built of massive concrete during the Soviet period and enhanced since with bunkers and tunnels. However, Putin was reluctant to increase the size of the Russian military commitment in Ukraine at the time. The unprecedented raft of sanctions against Russia and the freezing of its foreign exchange reserves presented the Kremlin with a serious economic problem. To mobilize a large number of military reserves would have thus further destabilized the economy in a direction Putin didn't want to go. The Russian military was thus hampered and had to avail itself of local militias in the Donbass region of Ukraine, specifically the Donetsk and Luhansk militias, that had been fighting for autonomy since 2014. Also, special forces like the Chechen forces were involved, and private armies like Prigozhin's Wagner group were all there together to do the frontline fighting, the heavy-duty fighting in this war. Russian conscripts were not used, although there were instances where they were, but the officers concerned were disciplined, and the conscripts duly returned to Russian border duties. So, although the commitment of the professional Russian military was thus kept at roughly 75,000 men over this initial period, this complement of men nevertheless played a crucial role in supporting the frontline assault and storming operations of the militias, special forces and private armies. It did this by suppressing the targets of attack with unprecedented levels of artillery fire and bombing. NATO observers recorded a shelling rate by Russia which exceeded Ukraine's, and more generally even NATO's capacity to respond to it, by a factor of 10 to 1. This was a crucial element in Russia's successful prosecution of the first siege, the first siege phase of the war, which led to the capture of such massively fortified locations as Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and Bakhmut. Russia's military-industrial capacity seemed to surprise NATO, although data ever since the year 2000, when Putin took over, shows a steady increase in the size of military-industrial production. The upward sloping curve shows definite pattern of acceleration also in the years 2011 and then again in 2014 after the seizure of Crimea. It is also important to note in that regard that statistics for military production in Russia do not take account either of the lower cost of living in Russia or the plentiful and cheap supply of energy. If one adjusted for those factors and read those numbers, they would have been made surprising reading for anyone paying attention. Russia had indeed rearmed massively with conventional weapons since the year 2000. As the siege phase of the war came to its final stages, news started to emerge about how the Russian economy had been able to shrug off US and Western sanctions. It was then, towards the end of 2022, that the Kremlin felt capable of allowing the Russian Ministry of Defense to announce the mobilization of 300,000 reservists. The call-up would come, however, with a change in strategy. Russian engineers were in the process of executing plans for the construction of a complex line of fortifications all along the front line and on Russia's border with Ukraine. The Russian war would now enter a defensive phase. In September 2022, Putin announced referenda intended to incorporate the Donbass republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, in addition to the provinces of Kherson and Zaporizhia, to form that protective ring around Crimea, which I mentioned earlier. Frontline fortifications will be built in this zone, several lines deep. One of NATO's multiple think tanks, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, refers to Russian fortifications in Ukraine being built, which were the most extensive defensive works in Europe since World War II, involving trenches, minefields, dragon teeth, and so on and so forth, intended to slow down any potential Ukrainian offensive operations. But the think tank goes on to add that the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was being planned could overcome these defenses and proceed to realize Ukrainian leader Zelensky's aim to retake Crimea. Essentially, what NATO was thinking when it began planning this counteroffensive, which is the counteroffensive which Mark Milley announced in his interview on May the 2nd, was that all those fortifications that stretched out over a frontline portion of 1,500 kilometers, not counting the extra fortifications along the stretches of the Russia-Ukraine border beyond that, that this whole area of fortifications could be overcome, and that this would be done thanks to a phenomenal list of advanced equipment supplied to the Ukrainian forces listed in the State Department's fact sheet of military assistance to Ukraine, 27th of June 2023. The link is provided in the description box below, as well as real-time battlefield intelligence provided to Ukraine by the US military's all-seeing eye, and the relevant link to that from the New York Times on May the 4th, 2023 is also provided below. The assumption made was that the US military essentially didn't have the necessary command and control to coordinate the kind of response right across this huge area of front line to repel a sophisticated attack planned and directed on behalf of the Ukraine by the United States. This assumption was mistaken. The counteroffensive has failed to reach the first line of Russian fortifications ever since it was launched on the 4th of June. And in the one spot where it has reached it, in a tiny spot, it hasn't been able to reach it, although it's tried over and over again. The article on the Global Shift website provides maps and video links showing them in action in the counteroffensive up to the 22nd of June to show how it failed. But a link to a new video in the description box below for the action on the 6th of July is provided just to be up to date, which still records that in respect to the counteroffensive there are still no results, as it says. But another video link for the action on the 3rd of July is added as well, which helps us to see reports of Russian statistics about counteroffensive losses of the Ukrainians during the period. The Russian statistics show that the Ukrainians have lost 2,500 tanks and other assaulted vehicles throughout this period. This is stated in the video at about 6.45 minutes into the video, and 20,000 soldiers either killed or very seriously wounded, and this is in the video at 2.39 minutes into the video. All of this is detailed in the description box below. Of course, one doesn't have to take Russian Ministry of Defense numbers reported in the video at face value. The article on the Global Shift website does discuss Defense Minister Shoigu's justifications for the numbers that his ministry produces, which he says are produced, are obtained from radio intercepts. But this brings me to the all-important matter now of how many Ukrainian soldiers have died during the course of this war, which I don't deal with in the website article. The same 3rd of July video I've just mentioned records a total tally, a tally of all Russian Defense Ministry daily announcements about total Ukrainian soldiers killed since the very beginning of the conflict, of 180,000 to 200,000 men, which is stated in the video at about 8 minutes into the video. I mention this figure for the following reasons. One, because it is a catastrophic number, it's a catastrophic number which explains why more and more Ukrainians have continually to be pressed into service and given inadequate training, only to be shoved onto the front line willy-nilly. Secondly, because it is a much higher number than admitted to by NATO and the United States. And thirdly, because the discrepancy between the Russian figures and the NATO and US figures could potentially indicate a fantastic level of cynicism and carelessness on the part of NATO and the US military leadership. They know the real level of losses, but to them it might appear that Ukrainians are simply cannon fodder. So how can we check any of these Russian figures without relying simply on Shoigu's statement that he gets it off radio intercepts from the Ukrainian military? Well, there is an exercise which we can go through. Firstly, a survey came out by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, which ran an Omnibus survey between May the 26th and June the 5th of 2023, a link to which I put in the description box below. That survey, the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology continually does surveys, but for this period, it said that 64% of Ukrainians have at least one close relative or friend who they found was injured. On average, they have 5 injured close people per person. And 63% have at least one close relative or friend who has died. On average, it says they have 3 deceased loved ones per person. If we take this survey and go on to look at what sociologist Carl Noah has written, Carl Noah has previously written on the matter of declining Ukrainian demographics, but he wrote another article recently specifically following the Kyiv survey that sought to calculate how that survey could possibly translate into numbers on deaths. The video description box below obviously contains a link to Carl Noah's article. The conclusion of the article is that overall, the analysis suggests that up to 188,000 Ukrainian soldiers and civilians have died in the war, although he qualifies this and says that this figure is likely to be an overestimate. Now, the point about doing this exercise is not to suggest that the Russian Ministry of Defense numbers are correct and that their methods are good and that we should rely on their statistics. It is merely to say that what appears to be the case is that the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to make estimates of the number of Ukrainians killed during this war and is not announcing the figures on the basis that it is doing some kind of psychological operations. On the other hand, we should consider that the much reduced NATO numbers must be some kind of reverse kind of psychological operation. Whatever the numbers, it is clear that the counteroffensive has failed. The reason for this becomes, we can see in a report from the Modern War Institute, which is at West Point, on the 15th of June, which is discussed in detail in the Global Shift article, the Global Shift website article. The report says that what is lost in the simplified narrative in the West is that despite the numerous and obvious shortcomings displayed in Russian military forces' performance in practice, the fact is that on a conceptual level, they're actually ahead of their time. So we have to consider that. This report states that in doctrinal terms, the Russian military are ahead of their time. If then the practical meets the conceptual on the current battlefield, then the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, directed by the United States all-seeing eye and enhanced with advanced weaponry, implies that the Russian military is perfecting or has perfected its doctrine in the course of this war. But there are also two obvious lacunae in the whole NATO optimism about the counteroffensive. A counteroffensive into which they have essentially pushed poor, unsuspecting Ukrainians into a trap. As a result of months of barrages of Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, targeting air defenses, Ukraine now lacks a proper air defense capability. That's the first lacuna. The second is the fact that it lacks the ability to counter Russian electronic warfare. The result of this is that you have a Ukraine military shoved into a situation where it is unable to suppress either Russian defenses or to suppress Russian communications. As a result of all of this, NATO is facing defeat in Ukraine, undoubtedly. Furthermore, talk of nuclear escalation in this war is just more nonsense added to all the nonsense. Russia is winning the conventional war, has no motive to go nuclear. Understood from this perspective, the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus on the Polish border, is merely a reminder to the United States that it has ruled out the nuclear option as well. On the other hand, we do have to understand from this analysis that Crimea is a core pillar of the resurrected Russian state, something which the political classes in Russia across the board are fully behind, and that Crimea is an existential factor which they will all defend to the last. Russia could have been granted access to it by international treaty without the need for annexation, without the subsequent war, and without the total destruction of Ukraine that has followed. If only it hadn't been for the neoconservative ideology espoused by NATO and its puppet masters in the United States foreign policy elite. This brings me to the second point about the US, about how US hegemony may be under threat. What does this NATO defeat mean for US hegemony? What this NATO defeat in Europe means for US hegemony. Previous wars have been in Vietnam, in Iraq. We have a war in Europe now, and that is key to how we need to answer this question. Now, the Biden-Harris security strategy sees China as a central strategic threat to its global dominance. Russia is mentioned, but it appears, to be a side issue. Russia is dangerous. How dangerous? It doesn't say. Why it's dangerous? It doesn't say. But I don't think this document was written with the possibility of a defeat of NATO in the European theatre as a possibility, as being at all possible. There is no doubt that China's announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 was a threat to US global dominance. China had Russia as its largest neighbor, the largest country in Asia, as a central plank of the Belt and Road Initiative. The idea of this initiative was to build fast transport links from China through Russia deep into Europe, with the most significant link being the Chongqing-Xinjiang Europe Railway, which had a terminus, of all places, in Germany's Duisburg, in the heart of the industrial Ruhr Valley. The idea that Europe, and particularly its industrial powerhouse, will become tethered to both China's market and its industrial machine in this way was unquestionably a threat to the hegemony of the United States, the global hegemony of the United States. But let us go back and run over why it is that Europe is so important to the way the United States has constructed the current world disorder. It's simple enough. US global hegemony has Europe as its anchor, and this dates back to the Cold War. But at that time, in the classic Cold War, not this Cold War .2, at that time, this was established as a voluntary association between the United States and Western European countries as sovereign states. It was only established as a coercive relationship, with the United States gaining what could be called ownership of NATO in the period when the Soviet Union began to disintegrate. The key threats to continuing US hegemony at that time were Helmut Kohl's drive to reunify Germany as East Germany fell headlong into the Western orbit, and Mikhail Gorbachev's offer to Western European leaders of a partnership with the Soviet Union, as it was still then, in a so-called common European home. But in that period, 1989 to 2002, the threat that loomed above them all was the European exchange rate mechanism that had been created by the EU as a waiting room for the launch of the euro in 1999. Dollar primacy had been predicated on euro-dollar lending by an assortment of international banks based in London. If international lending would switch to any great degree into euros, that would be the end of dollar primacy. The action in Yugoslavia was actually started by Kohl and his foreign minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who sought to create a zone of influence by prizing Croatia in particular out of Yugoslavia, essentially pursuing a single-minded policy of independence for that republic. And this is what essentially triggered the Yugoslav wars. the United States reacted very swiftly. It sought to upstage Germany by taking over and seeking independence for Bosnia. Bosnia had an even more difficult and complex ethnic picture than Croatia did, thus adding fuel to the fire. The US had already tricked Gorbachev into removing Soviet troops from Germany by 1994, while keeping NATO forces in Germany and its own nuclear weapons there. Then, in the 1995 Bosnian War, which followed clashes between Bosnians, Croats and Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the US both gained complete control of NATO forces to prosecute this war and successfully built a Western civilizational narrative that was opposed to a Slavic civilizational concept to include Serbia and, by the way, Russia. Having ensured in 1992 that Britain would stay out of the euro with the help of George Soros, and as the date for the launch of the euro loomed in 1999, NATO expansion towards Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary followed. An expansion that encircled the reunited Germany. Having thus, on the one hand, successfully polarized the politics of a new greater Europe with its raft of new Eastern member states, and then imposing itself at the head of NATO, the United States launched a final war against Serbia in 1999. The way this happened was that Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, had initially listed the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, as a terrorist group. Kosovo was clearly a majority Albanian province of Serbia with a minority Serbian population, and the objective of the KLA was to gain independence for Kosovo and, if possible, to remove the Serbs. So the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, was listed as a terrorist group, and at an early period, late 1997, early 1998, Madeleine Albright agreed with Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader, that Serbia could carry out a counterinsurgency campaign against it. But suddenly in October 1998, Albright made all the necessary moves to recognize the KLA as a freedom-fighting organization and the Serbian counterinsurgency as an act of ethnic cleansing. A so-called humanitarian military action was then announced against Serbia with an aggressive NATO bombing campaign that Germany was forced to participate in breach of its constitution. It is after that period, in which the United States consolidated its hegemony over Europe, that the United States sprung into its unipolar moment as it launched its wars in the Middle East and pursued further rounds of NATO expansion in 2004 and 2008. Never in all that time has it confronted an antagonist with anywhere near the capacity of the resurrected Russian state we see today. As it sought to keep China out of Europe and Europe out of Russia, the United States concocted the conditions for war in the one country that will be regarded by the Russians as foundational for the energy politics of their state. The purpose of this could only be to destroy this new creation and possibly to go on further to encircle China. But NATO now faces defeat in Ukraine, while Ukraine itself faces demographic implosion. Not Ukraine, not any other nation in Europe has the capacity at the moment, in industrial and human resources terms, to confront Russia. The United States, as a divided nation today, does not have the political capacity to intervene, but even if it did, it would not have the conventional capability on land to do so. The Belarusian deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons has been undertaken to remind the United States, which is in a very difficult position facing the situation in Ukraine right now, to remind the United States of its pledge not to use nuclear weapons, not to go nuclear itself. I write in the article on the website that Brigadier General Erich Watt, a recently retired military advisor to Chancellor Angela Merkel, that Watt predicts that as news of a NATO defeat, along with the truth about its horrific human and material costs, tears through the veil of the neoconservative NATO narrative that dominates Western media, a political backlash against the US hegemon in the heartland of empire is unavoidable. Now I go on to my third point about the Prigozhin gambit and Russian politics. Two statements here can be said to be true at the same time. One, if the sanctions leveled at Russia couldn't topple Putin, neither could Prigozhin's antics. And the second, because of the sanctions leveled at Russia, Prigozhin's antics couldn't topple Putin. Prigozhin served the Russian regime well in the first siege phase of the war. In the defensive phase of the war, when full frontal assaults would no longer be necessary, his Wagner forces were going to be reined in. Their members would have had to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. And so the man rebelled. His business was being taken away from him. But this rebellion was hopeless. It was hopeless as soon as Putin went on television and labeled him a rebel. Troops started to fall away as soon as they realized what was really happening. The lined convoy trucks driving on the M4 motorway towards Moscow was particularly vulnerable to attack. No one, however, realized that Wagner had a Panzer air defense system. And this tells you everything you need to know about the independence of this particular private military contractor. But once that became common knowledge, after they had shot down a couple of helicopters circling the convoy, once that had become common knowledge, it wouldn't be long before a missile attack would have taken out the whole convoy, including the air defense system. If Prigozhin hadn't surrendered, there would have been a bloodbath. Effectively, there was no person or political sector of the Russian community rallied to Prigozhin's banner. His gambit collapsed as soon as it erupted. The only thing to come out of the whole affair is criticism of the oligarchic networks, Prigozhin and Wagner being a prime example, that Putin uses to run the state. The leader of the main opposition and the most critical of the oligarchs is Gennady Zyuganov of the Communist Party. But he was one of the first to rally to Putin, saying that winning the war had a priority over anything else. There is the tiny breakaway Communist Workers' Party, which is more critical, but not to the point of breaking with Putin. Indeed, possibly the most critical was Dmitry Medvedev, deputy head of the National Security Council, who made snide remarks about the fact that all he could see around him were pigs' snouts everywhere. I think he was quoting the novelist Gogol, I'm not sure. In that regard, it's worth reading the text of Putin's address to the Defense Ministry. The Defense Ministry personnel were arrayed before him, and he was talking to them about the Prigozhin affair. I attach a link to the Kremlin website on that subject in the description box below, but you'll have to be patient if you want to read it, because the Kremlin website takes a long time to load. In that meeting, he talks to the Defense Ministry personnel, appearing quite contrite, making excuses for Prigozhin, saying that Prigozhin had served his country well in the war. And indeed, in the siege phase of the war, he did a lot. Putin was arguing that, his rebellion had to be viewed in that context. But actually it appears that what he was worried about most were the finances to do with the whole of the Wagner group. He makes clear that the state paid Wagner's salaries and its costs in full, but that now fraud and corruption investigations were underway, which he said he hoped would not reveal that too much money had been stolen. Anyway, I'll leave that up to you to read and see what you feel about Putin's reaction to the whole thing. Thank you for listening. For our full analysis of these issues, including sources, please read our latest article published on globalshift.com, which you can find a link to in the video description box below.